With these YouTube episodes, I won't be going into creative systems theory and its multiple patterning concepts, at least in any detail. For that, you can turn to my books, in particular the book Creative Systems Theory, or some of the longer articles on the Cultural Maturity blog. But a few particular insights from the theory help highlight the deep way that cultural mature perspective is new. They also bring attention to the power of the kind of understanding that becomes possible with cultural maturity's cognitive reordering. I've described how one especially striking outcome with cultural maturity's cognitive changes is how the kind of thinking that results often reconciles quandaries that are impossible to address, limited to the assumptions of times past. This episode's reflections are adapted from my book, Quick and Dirty Answers to the Biggest of Questions. They address a couple of arguably the most ultimate of ultimate questions: existence as a whole, the larger scheme of things, and our place in it. While these reflections extend beyond the formal thinking of creative systems theory, they at least provoke interesting thought. So, can creative systems theory help us think about the whole shebang, existence in its entirety? Here they might not immediately seem terribly pertinent. The theory's contribution lies with the human dimension, with who we are and how we understand. But in fact, just that is what makes it relevant. Understanding our conclusions about existence as a whole necessarily starts with understanding the cognitive lenses through which we make sense of it. We can't in the end know for sure what is out there. Indeed, as philosophers are quick to tell us, we can't even be sure there is an out there to know. But there's a lot we can say about understanding and understanding's evolution. Creative systems theory addresses why through history we have thought not just about ourselves, but also about the physical and the biological in the specific ways that we have. And of particular importance for these reflections, it proposes that there is a lot we can say about how understanding today is changing. So why did Newton and Descartes see a clockwork universe? And why before that did people in the Middle Ages see a universe ordered by religious and moral principles? What they understood reflected how they understood. And today that evolution continues. A clockwork's picture of the universe is more and more often proving insufficient. Creative systems theory helps us make sense of why, what may lie ahead, and also why the world as we are beginning to see it has the characteristics that it does. Creative systems theory proposes that we can understand thinking at the far edge of understanding in terms of the cognitive reordering that today accompanies cultural maturity's new chapter in culture story. Integrative meta-perspective, in bringing a more encompassing and more complete vantage to understanding, replaces age of reason formulations in which truth reduces to rationality and simple cause and effect relationships, with ways of thinking that are more systemic and also more dynamic. It reveals a world that is more complexly interwoven and often contradictory seeming than what we have known. It's also a world in which change, and often change of a generative, evolutionary sort, becomes inherent to how things work. It's also a world in which uncertainty plays a key role. We could say a world that's more creative. But when we apply the word creative to existence as a whole, we need to take particular care. We've tended historically to project how we have thought onto the world, in effect, seeing the world in our own image. We witnessed this with the Age of Reason's rationalistic, how the Age of Reason's rationalistic lens gave us a machine world. If we are not careful, we can fall prey to a related trap and make the whole of existence creative in the specific sense that we are creative as humans. Fortunately, culturally mature perspective and a creative frame can provide help here too. The stepping back that comes with integrative meta-perspective's overarching advantage helps us better distinguish ourselves from what we wish to understand. It also helps us better appreciate not just the rich interconnections and often provocative generativities of existence as a whole, but also essential differences in ways that various aspects of existence may be creative. Just for fun, we could call the encompassing picture the results the Big Bang theory of existence. I don't consider it a formal part of creative systems theory. Indeed, not a theory at all in the traditional sense. Rather, it is more a metaphor or a thought experiment that follows from creative systems theory's conclusions. What it does is invite us to reflect on what existence as a whole might look like when viewed through a creative lens. I've emphasized how a defining characteristic of needed new ways of understanding is that they leave behind the polarized assumptions of times past. A couple overarching polarity-related observations help with this big picture reframing task. The first relates to how it has been our tendency in times past to divide not just particular beliefs, but also existence as a whole into polar worlds. We've done this in different ways depending on when in history we looked. We've also done it in different ways depending on whether our basic inclinations tend more toward the material scientific or the spiritual religious side of things. In modern times, science has tended to divide existence into animate and inanimate, lumping ourselves together with the creaturely and setting this in contrast to a dead world of rocks and rivers. Religion has tended more to place the human species separate, make us in some way chosen with dominion over the rest of creation. With cultural maturities, cognitive changes, we would expect that we might begin to think about existence in its entirety more as a whole, more systemically. It is something we're beginning to see. The second overarching polarity-related observation concerns change and just how it happens. Every cultural period has its creation stories, explanations for how what we see around us came into being. For the Dogon tribe of Mali, it is a tale of how Amma broke the egg of the world. Christianity has its Hebrew Genesis. Modern science has its Big Bang. In addition, every cultural period has had its explanations for why things work as they do day to day. Both why things change and why, too, they are as stable as they often are, from the whims of gods to the modern age image of a clockwork's universe. Past explanations with regard to change have also been polar. They've posited some separate driving impetus, be it in earliest times an animistic force, or with modern, more mechanistic thinking, an action with its equal and opposite reaction. Ideas about change, too, are changing. Increasingly, we find thinking that makes change and stability together aspects of larger ways of understanding. Dualistic formulations, both of the extreme type that posit a separate animating force and of the more mundane sort that juxtapose separate causes and effects, are giving way to more encompassing and dynamic ways of thinking. And often dynamic refers not just to having more moving parts, but to being somehow generative, change, and the coherence through which we identify something as having existence become parts of a single, larger, more self-organizing picture. These two overarching polarity-related observations taken together help bring a more systemically conceived picture into focus. Wherever we look, when we leave behind past dualistic assumptions and polar projections, we find ourselves thinking in terms of complex interactions, dynamic change processes, and the necessary role of uncertainty. As part of this expansion of perspective, we also better appreciate existence as a whole as dynamic and interrelated. In addition, we begin to better appreciate the unique ways that various layers, levels of existence give this more creative picture expression. It suffices for our purposes to keep things simple and talk in terms of three levels that everyday thought suggests. There is inanimate creation, there is life, and there is this odd addition, conscious life, including ourselves and to a lesser degree other higher life forms. Seen through the lens of culturally mature perspective, these layers, levels become fundamentally linked aspects of an encompassing whole, and also unique manifestations of existence's generativity. Limited to how we commonly think, we could find this at once more coherent and more multi-layered outcome confusing. More conventionally, ideas that highlight connectedness and ideas that delineate difference work as opposites. But this kind of result is also almost the rule with culturally more mature conception. I find a simple and familiar image useful. Neapolitan ice cream. Rather than wholly different categories, we get a reality in which each layer level is at once the same stuff, like ice cream, and wholly different. Actually, what we see is somewhat stretches the metaphor. The various layers, levels are not just different in kind, as with flavors. They reflect distinct levels of organization. The system's concept of emergent properties helps us complete the needed stretch. Emergent properties are characteristics unique to a set of systemic relationships. In the new picture, each level is defined, separated, joined by an emergent property. In this case, existence in contrast to non-existence, life, and the capacity for conscious reflection. Creative Systems Theory's creative frame helps make this basic description more specific. Instead of ice cream, with creative systems theory, the same stuff becomes creation. And what differentiates these various emergent realities is the amount of creative information each inherently embodies. Each new layer level is distinguished by a creative multiplier or several creative multipliers working together that radically increase the rate at which creative reorganization can take place. In the case of life, this creative multiplier is natural selection and the learning adaptive capacities that come with life's workings. In the case of ourselves, the multiplier is the option of fresh creation happening with every new aha that arises with conscious awareness and our unique tool-making, idea-making, meaning-making prowess. The innovations that separate the various layers, levels of existence qualitatively increase the amount of creation, formativeness each succeeding layer level is capable of embodying, manifesting. In this way, the application of a creative frame helps us both appreciate interconnectedness and grasp just how layers, levels are different one from the other. Let's briefly look more closely at the various layers, levels in this kind of picture. With each over the last century, we've seen at least the beginnings of a more creative kind of interpretation. We find interconnectedness more deeply appreciated, change manifesting as an intrinsic attribute of that systemic level's functioning, uncertainty playing a newly integral role, and the acknowledgement of dynamics that can seem contradictory, limited to usual ways of thinking. Let's start with the physical. It's with the hard sciences that people are most likely to appreciate that we've witnessed something new and creative in a sense. Albert Einstein, with special relativity, provocatively linked the before separate worlds of time and space, and later with general relativity provided a more systemic approach to understanding gravity, a phenomena that always before had been thought of as separate and mysterious. Both formulations left mechanistic deterministic thinking intact, but Einstein's physics colleagues and ultimately the general public also rightly came to view these contributions as revolutionary. The early thinking of quantum mechanics, the work of Niels Bohr and colleagues, presented a more direct challenge, throwing understanding into a world that directly confronted deterministic assumptions. Waves and particles, energy and matter, suddenly became less things than alternative ways of thinking. In quantum mechanics, the answer to the question of which is most real depends on when and how you look. Contributions at the biggest of cosmic scales would prove similarly radical. Edwin Hubble's demonstration that the universe is expanding required that science abandoned its previous picture of a stable, eternally constant universe. The Big Bang Theory, the idea that the universe in fact had a beginning and a dramatic one, followed from these essential observations. Today, insights from our study of the heavens reveal an ever more dramatic, shape-shifting world of quasars, pulsars, white dwarfs, and black holes. Black holes in particular point toward a more generative interpretation. In the new picture, creation, rather than being either created by a separate entity or something that has always existed, becomes integral in the larger story of existence. Another contribution from physics has gotten particular attention in recent decades, the phenomenon known as entanglement. It turns out that subatomic particles that are linked by virtue of being complementary can remain linked even when separated by significant differences. The connection is not causal in the traditional sense, and it is immediate, not limited to the speed of light. While entanglement was originally assumed to require proximity, recent experiments done between an orbiting satellite and the Earth suggest that distance is not an obstacle. Entangled links are fragile and easily disrupted, but the phenomenon of entanglement has rich potential application in both communication and computing. It also raises fascinating questions about the nature of connectedness in the universe and just how connected things may be. So next, life. Arguably, biology's newly creative picture began even earlier with Charles Darwin's publication of Origins of the Species and Gregor Mendel's later work with pea plants that demonstrated the actions of invisible factors that we now call genes. Evolutionary biology presents a picture of life in which creation, rather than something that happens to life, is instead followed in an ongoing way from the nature of life. Ecological thought, first formally introduced with explorations of food webs and food cycles in the 1920s, added important further pieces to biology's new, more systemic picture. Today it is so familiar to us that we can miss its radical significance. Both interconnectedness and change are intrinsic to good ecological thought. Increasingly, it has become second nature for biologists to think in terms of communities and ecosystems and the interplaying life cycles of organisms and populations. neither of these contributions in biology, at least in their early forms, fundamentally challenged mechanistic assumptions. The best of thinking today in both evolutionary and systems biology begins to do so. But new attention brought by biologists to an age-old question confronted the classical picture directly. That question, what is life? A person might think that the answer would be obvious for a biologist, but in fact, biology has never been able to address the life question in any ultimately satisfying manner. Historically, the life question has been answered in two main ways. Most recently, scientists have tended to think of life as just a very complex machine. Looking back, we are more likely to find dualistic explanations that locate life's source in some separate animating force, from Aristotle's unmoved mover to medieval times, a separate soul that direct actions, to with 19th century vitalism, a separate animating energy. With the middle of the last century, early systems thinkers challenged both views and argued that we needed to understand living systems as integrated wholes. Biologist Ludwig von Bertalanffy presented the first formal explication of this kind of perspective with his 1940s book General Systems Theory. His thinking emphasized the fact that living systems are open systems, systems that maintain themselves in highly dynamic states far from equilibrium. Somewhat later, we saw attention given to feedback loops and self-regulation. The work of cognitive theorists such as Gregory Bateson, who argued that if we understood understanding deeply, we will have understood life, has particular pertinence. Recent contributions from biology have added a further important cognition-related insight. More traditionally, cognitive mechanisms have been framed in command and control terms. Brains ran bodies, DNA ran cells. We are better at recognizing how cells, tissues, and organs of more complex organisms often engage their worlds through complex networked and often highly decentralized informational processes. Biology's version of today's more systemically interconnected, often mysterious and contradictory, uncertainty-permeated picture has deepened and filled out considerably in recent decades. Increasingly, we are recognizing how creatures of all sorts are more complex and complexly intelligent than we have before assumed. We are also better appreciating how evolution is as much about cooperation as competition, and not just cooperation with one's own kind, but also between species. Think of the increasingly recognized role of bacteria in our gut. They keep us healthy, and we in turn keep them nourished and alive. Of particular significance, the question of what it means to think about living systems in living terms is being recognized more and more by biologists as not just legitimate, but pivotal to effective understanding. And human life. Creative systems theory's framing of understanding in the human spheres starts with an explicitly creative assertion that what makes us unusual as creatures is the audacity of our creative proclivities. The theory describes how human intelligence is structured specifically to support and drive creative formative processes. And it delineates how we can understand all manner of phenomena, such as the human experience of meaning, the ways human developmental processes progress, and how it is that different ones of us think and act as differently as we do in terms of patterns that follow from the ultimately creative nature of human intelligence. We find precursors to this kind of understanding in the best of early thinking in psychology psychiatry and sociology, beginning with simple yet historically radical recognition that much that is most important in being human functions out of conscious awareness. We can understand much of the history of 20th century psychiatry and psychology as an inquiry into various ways of knowing and how they work together to make us who we are. And the middle part of the century saw efforts to bring formal systems thinking into psychology. Such efforts today are further supported by advances in cognitive science that have accompanied technical innovations such as advanced imaging techniques. One increasingly recognized conclusion is particularly pertinent to this more systemically complex self-organizing picture. It appears that conscious awareness, rather than being located in some particular part of the brain, is more accurately an emergent capacity of our neurology as a whole. So cultural maturity's cognitive reordering suggests a picture of existence of a whole that is both more dynamically interconnected and more clearly differentiated than how we have thought of things in the past. The worlds of the physical, the biological, and of more conscious creatures such as ourselves come to reflect emergent systemic levels within a more encompassing systemic picture. In this more complex and uncertainty-permeated interpretation, existence as a whole, at least as we can know it, becomes an important new sense creative. And in what makes layers and levels different can similarly be thought of in creative terms. Succeeding layers are distinguished by creative multipliers, innovations that produce quantum leaps in the rate at which creative reorganization can take place. It's important to reemphasize in putting forward this creative interpretation that creative systems theory does not claim to tell us what is actually out there. Its contribution lies with understanding the implications of how human cognitive processes work. Personally, I'm willing to go a little further. In contrast to many theorists with more postmodern inclinations, I'm comfortable making the leap that there is in fact something out there to understand, if for no other reason that intelligence would have little reason to be if there weren't. I'm also comfortable with the conclusion that ideas that reflect cultural mature perspective take us a bit closer to what actually is. In part, this is because each step in understanding's evolution appears to have done so. It's also because of how integrative metaperspective produces understanding that is inherently more encompassing than what we have known in times past. We might expect it to be not just more complete, but also more ultimately in keeping with what is in fact the case. A creative frame invites conjecture with regard to a related but more specific eternal quandary, our place in the larger scheme of things. We can put this question in science versus religion terms. From a scientific viewpoint, we can appropriately ask, as many great thinkers have asked, are we but a speck in an essentially purposeless universe, an odd, momentary impulse of no real ultimate significance? Or do we better think of ourselves as God's special children, as most religions through time have in some way seen us? A creative perspective offers a third option, neither quite so random nor quite so grand, but arguably intriguing. Reframed, the question becomes, what is our place and significance in creation, as creation becomes what the scheme of things is ultimately about? A creative interpretation emphasizes that not all creation is the same, and proposes that the answer to our question lies in just how this is so. Interpretations of times past have tended either to idealize the human, make us separate and special, or simply lump us together with life more generally. I've described how a creative interpretation offers that it may all be more like Neapolitan ice cream. Our place in the larger scheme of things? At least we represent a fascinating bit of creative innovation, with the jury far from in on just how ultimately successful. If we want to feel a bit more special, we could claim ours to be a particularly significant sort of creative innovation. We are the only creature, at least on this particular earth, that is not just consciously aware, but aware of itself as part of something that has evolved and continues to evolve. In an interesting sense, through us, creation, not just as fact, but as process, has become conscious of itself. In a way, this interpretation makes our human achievement even more remarkable. But it also makes it tenuous, more explicitly experimental. It is quite possible that exactly that which makes us special, our great creative prowess, will be our undoing. Our time on the planet has been extremely short compared to, say, the dinosaurs. For us, 300,000 years with civilization, a product of only the most 20,000, compared to 180 million years for the dinosaurs. And with growing frequency, modern invention and human choice more generally has dangerously two-edged potential consequences. In our time, the human creative experiment continues, and in ways that have major implications for its ultimate success. Creative systems theory, with its concept of integrative meta-perspective, describes the possibility and necessity of a more aware and more deeply engaged relationship with our creative, tool-making, meaning-making natures. Homo sapiens sapiens, man the wise, is perhaps coming to better deserve his audaciously proclaimed status, proclaimed twice over for emphasis. If the theory is accurate, certainly our continued creative well-being and perhaps our survival depends on it. We can think of this task as what ultimately defines today's needed new common sense. Thank you. Questions, as always, appreciated.